Greetings, my lovelies. This is Blake here, and welcome to my review of the Raid 2 Berandal. I'm not entirely sure if I'm pronouncing that subtitle correctly, but it doesn't really matter because they should have just changed the name into the Raid 2 101 Ways to Violently Murder Someone, because goddamn, this movie was vicious. If your standard of quality is how many ways can the human body sustain fatal damage, then this is your Citizen Kane. So I was a big fan of the first Raid. I actually saw it when it was released in theaters, even though it was only a limited release. And, it had virtually minimal plot, some stupid writing here and there, but the narrative only existed to really serve awesome hardcore action sequences, and it succeeded in doing that. I loved the gunfights, I loved the fist fights, and it was just 100% action spectacle, but it was good action spectacle, so it appealed to my taste, but I do understand if you did not like it, because it is in a lot of ways just kind of a live action video game that just happens to be more exhilarating than most live-action video games. So I was eager to see where a sequel would go, and when I heard they were making it, it definitely caught my interest. And my only real concern at that point was, would this go the same route that the Ong Bak franchise did, when the films became progressively worse, and I didn't really feel they needed to be sequels to Ong Bak. But it wasn't going to stop me from watching it. After all, I was eager to watch Ong Bak 3, and I knew that was not going to be a very good movie. But then the reviews started coming in, and the critics really loved this, and general audiences embraced it even more. So now I'm getting really, really excited, and I was frustrated because a few weeks ago it was supposed to be released, albeit in a limited capacity, and it wasn't playing anywhere near me, so I was a little bummed out at that. But then I saw a TV spot where they said that it was getting a bigger release this week, and I'm like, come on, please play near me, please play near me, I'll watch you instead of Oculus. And I actually do kind of want to see Oculus, but just be playing within a 20-minute radius from my house. And luckily it was playing at the theater closest to me at a very convenient time, so I definitely was going to check it out. And it was then I noticed the running time and started to get a little scared, because good or bad, martial arts movies usually do not need to be over 2 hours, and this one was like 2.5 hours. I think even a little longer. Well, maybe not. Maybe it was a little shorter. I think it was like 149 minutes, which obviously would be a minute shorter than 2.5 hours, but it's close enough. But naturally, I watched it, and you know what? I loved this movie. I would say so far it is or at least my favorite film of 2014. The only one to achieve the 4-star rating from me of all the movies I've watched this year. So I really needed this, because 2014 has sucked for me so badly. But discussing this movie is going to be a little tricky. In fact, if you want to hear my thoughts in a more organized manner, please read my written review of this. I'll provide a link in the description. And of course, if you want to read or hear about my full feelings regarding the first Raid, you could always either watch my vlog or read my review on that one. So let's just begin with the action scenes. When describing the choreography, all you need to know is somebody performs an action, whether it's a punch or a kick, and the person who's being targeted performs a reaction, whether it's taking the punch or kick, blocking, dodging, countering, whatever. And it's doing that in a way that flows in a very fast speed. So it all feels very natural, not staged, while at the same time you're seeing a variety of different movements and techniques that keeps this combat, or whatever combat you were watching, seem fresh. And both Raid movies, I thought, really delivered in that regard. I thought the choreography was great, but one thing I thought that made them stand out, well, there's two things, but the first thing that made them stand out was I didn't really feel like I was watching traditional styles clash. Now, when you watch a Jet Li, Jackie Chan, Bruce Lee movie, you do see their styles within their movements. You see actual martial arts being performed, even if it's a more cinematic version of said martial arts. Well, even though the fighters in this movie mostly, I believe, perform silat, am I pronouncing that right? It's an Indonesian style that I don't know a whole lot about, but there's a more traditional form of it you could see in Berandal, which was made by the same people as this. But when it came to the Raid movies, I really did not feel like I was watching a formal martial arts on display. I felt like I was watching street fighting that was being choreographed as if they were using formal martial arts. So the punches and kicks look very practical. The stances look very practical. There's nothing fancy about them at all, but at the same time, their techniques and movements are so quick and so impressive that, I'd say the choreography was just as good as something you'd get from, Jet Li or Jackie Chan. But there's one part that made me laugh in this movie, and you see a little bit of it in the previews, but the main character, Rama, who's played by Iko Uwais, I'm going to probably be butchering his name throughout this entire video, and he's fighting pretty much the main villain, the mad dog of this movie, which is kind of an ironic statement when you think about it, because the guy who played Mad Dog from the first movie is in it in a very different role. But when they start to fight, you actually do see a formal start to their fighting, where they both get into traditional stances, and their movements are, what I presume Silat is in its purest form. But almost immediately they drop it and just start tearing into each other, using the locations, using whatever props they can grab. And once again, I felt like I was just watching street fighting, but in a much more stylized, choreographed form. So I liked that about both of these movies, and I thought they did a good job at keeping that entertaining. There's always a variety to the techniques, and they're all impressive to watch. It's obvious all these people in this movie have legit skills, whether it's something they could utilize in real life or if it's just all cinematic, which is very common. And I've always found it ironic that Chuck Norris is probably the most legitimately badass of all the martial arts action stars, because he had a real fighting career, whereas like Jackie Chan, for example, is mostly all for show, and yet Jackie Chan is so much more fun to watch. Well, I don't know how tough these guys are in real life, but they all are very fun to watch in regards to how they deliver their fight scenes. But let's face it, the choreography is going to be overshadowed by the extreme violence. And make no mistake, the first Raid made most hard R action flicks look PG-13 in comparison. Well, this makes the first Raid look PG-13 in comparison. It's just so insanely violent, and people tend to die in very different and unique ways. And even when you see something that you technically have seen before, the way that it's shot and the way the gore effect works really does make it seem the kills seem very unique. For example, you see a character get half his face blown off by a shotgun. Nothing new, but the angle they show it really gives you a good look at the insides of their brain, but it's at a distance to where you could still see the rest of their body, and you could tell that it was this person who just had their face blown off. I don't know, something about that really stood out whenever somebody would get killed in this movie. And then you got like somebody wielding hammers, and they're just tearing chunks of their victims' flesh out using these weapons, and of course like the bat. And this is really where the sound design comes into play, because one villain has this aluminum bat and he's just beating the shit out of his victims, and the sound effects really make that hard to watch. And it's funny because whenever the audience I see a movie with, whenever they really participate with the movie, it's usually in a comedy where they laugh, or sometimes in a horror movie where you'll hear some screams, although that's usually only when you have a younger crowd. Like if you see that a horror movie at 6 p.m. where you have a bunch of teenagers, they're the ones who are going to do all the screaming. But here I saw it like the early afternoon with all old people, or at least people my age, if not older, and man, they were really crying out in distress at how extreme these kills got. It still gives me chills just thinking about it. But another thing too, where I think this film surpasses the original, is how the fights are shot. The cinematography in the first film was very dark, very grainy, and it worked for that tone. But here, the cinematography is much more clear. There's much more effort in regards to how each shot is framed, where everybody is positioned, where all the props are. So every single shot looks gorgeous. There's a lot more artistry, and I hate to use that word. There's a lot more artistry found in each every single scene in this movie just based on whether it's the sets or primarily how the sets are filmed. And it definitely isn't afraid to get close when it comes to showing off the violent deaths either, or somebody getting their arm broken or whatever. But this is a gorgeous movie, and that's an interesting contrast to the excessive violence on display. And there's also a lot of gimmicks when it comes to the fight scenes. You don't really see any normal fight. Either there's going to be some extreme use of props. They'll grab a chair or anything they could use as a weapon and just beat their enemy to death with it, or they'll use the locations. So like the first scene is the main character is in the bathroom and he's being attacked by this entire gang, and he's using the compact location to his advantage at first, but eventually it starts to work against him, and that really, I think, helped added its own diversity to the action sequences, and that really made it easier to endure their incredibly long running time. Now, this is probably the most important thing you need to know about this movie. If you liked The Raid, the first one, or you disliked it, I want you to take those feelings and throw them away, because they are totally irrelevant in regards to whether you will appreciate the sequel. Yes, I just described how they are similar in regards to the violence, and I do believe The Raid 2 does deliver better action, if only in the way that it was filmed. But other than that, these are two totally different movies. They have very different goals, very different styles, and I actually think if you did not like The Raid, you probably will appreciate this one a lot more. But at the same time, if you did like The Raid, you have to really consider what about it you liked. If you just want the 100% action spectacle of the first film, you might be disappointed, because this one does focus more on the plot and the characters. And really, though, where I think this film worked for me the most, as much as I loved everything on individual levels, like the fight scenes, I thought it was perfectly paced. This is a 2.5 hour long movie. That's usually a bit too long for me, but I was at no point ever bored or ever exhausted because this movie was going on so long. If it had more action, I think it would have drawn more attention to the parts that slowed down, and that would have totally disrupted the pace. It had the perfect amount of action, but at the same time it knew when to slow down and when to focus on plot and character. And whenever you start thinking about how, there hasn't been a fight scene in a while, well, then immediately we'll get to the next fight scene, and it just meant the entire film just flowed perfectly. I was never bored. I was always thoroughly entertained, even if there is technically, I don't want to say less action than what the first film had, but there's a significant less percentage of action if you compare them both. I mean, the first movie probably was like 75 to 80% action sequences, whereas this one's probably more like 40%. The good thing there is at least I thought the non-action sequences were just as compelling as the action sequences, just for very different reasons. I made an attachment to the characters. I was very interested in all their plights, and it was kind of sad when something bad would happen to them. This has a very conventional story when you think about it. In fact, it's really just the martial arts version of Eastern Promises, but it throws enough monkey wrenches into everybody's plans, from the heroes to the villains, that it always made what happened compelling. It was every single situation was very suspenseful and intense, or moving and sad, or even happy and almost funny. The film never lost an emotion on me. I always felt what the film wanted me to feel, and the acting and dialogue is much better than what the first film had, which wasn't bad as much as it was just standard. Once again, the focus of that movie was the action, whereas this film, it wants to be the full experience. It wants to give you awesome action sequences. It wants to give you characters you could root for, and it wants to give you just the all-around, once again, experience. And I thought it succeeded as that. But that's really all I have to say. The music, I thought, was really good too. A few scenes just really left an impact on me, even though it had nothing to do with the action. Like, some of the sets were just really cool. I love, for example, this one room that's all red. Like, the way the cinematographer captures that reminded me a lot of Stanley Kubrick, especially with The Shining. And this isn't even a horror movie, but those moments would kind of creep me out. So that was cool. Then I love also the scene where, I won't spoil what happens, but it takes place in the snow, which I hear is kind of weird because it doesn't snow in that area. But it's such a beautiful scene that I'm glad they had it in there. In fact, there are some subplots you could argue they could have easily removed and it wouldn't have really affected the overall story, such as, for example, the guy who played Mad Dog from the first film subplot. It almost in a way feels like padding, but it's executed so perfectly that I'm glad they kept it in, because I did find that character to be interesting. I found his situations to be very involving, and the way it's resolved is incredibly tear-jerking. And not to mention, I just love that guy. I think he's an awesome actor. I want to see more of him. If there's any weak point, it's that I found the main character of Rama to be kind of boring compared to all these supporting characters who are so much more compelling. I think the actor is fine, but he's not great. He's like Tony Jaa, that he's acceptable when he has a role that doesn't force him to go beyond his limitations. And this film, I never felt it made him do anything he was not capable of doing. He delivered his lines, I thought, effectively, and his emotions were clear enough. But the problem is Rama is such a standard hero. In the first film, he was a straight-up good cop who just knew how to kick a lot of ass. And in this film, he's more the disillusioned, angry cop that you pretty much saw Leonardo DiCaprio play in The Departed. And I didn't really know if I bought that transition. I felt like I was watching a different character that was not the same guy from the first one, even though he had the same name and the same actor. But at the same time, even then, I thought the rest of the movie carried him, because a lot of the subplots that really weren't necessary or maybe were underdeveloped, they really did help tie into that character. So like the character who's played by the guy who played Mad Dog, he in a lot of ways kind of represents a what-if scenario, the kind of person Rama could easily become. And then like I thought the relationship between him and then the boss's son, it was a little underdeveloped, and I didn't really feel any kind of connection there. But then it occurred to me that there was no connection. They both saw each other as tools and nothing more. So that really, in a way, was executed perfectly. So like even every time I tried to be the real critical critic who has to find something wrong with this movie, there was always something that kind of countered that point. So in a way, there was nothing really serious. There was no serious problem I had with this movie, so I just thoroughly loved it. If you can watch it, please watch it. Support this movie. I will be so bummed out if it bombs, because it deserves as many. It deserves as much money as it could make, because I did think it was an exceptional film, and I'm now really excited to see the Raid 3. So, once again, if you want to read my written review where I probably clarified my points much better, I'm losing my voice. I need water. Please read that. Follow me on Facebook, on Twitter. I also did a written review of The Bone Collector, The Bone Snatcher, or was it The Bone Snatcher or The Bone Collector? I think it was The Bone Snatcher. It's a horror flick, so read that. And I've done all the way through the first 9 Dragon Ball Z movies. Some bad news you may have noticed. Freewebs got real pissy with me, and they shut down all my reviews that I placed on Freewebs before I moved to my current website. So that's all frozen. I have no idea what I'm going to do with that now, but I'll keep you updated on Twitter. So that's why you should follow me on Twitter. Now try to get a Kick-Ass of Awesome episode up this week too, probably on Ninja 2. But that's all I have to say. I hope you enjoyed this video, and I'll see you guys later.